And let's dig down into some of the details of the report. It's found that building a large-scale nuclear reactor in Australia would likely cost about $8.5 billion, noting that's a best-case scenario. Do those kind of figures align with yours as you put the finishing touches on your own nuclear policy?
Well, as you can understand, I won't be announcing the coalition policy today, but I do welcome the fact that the CSIRO, for the first time, is now looking at including proven large reactors around the world in their analysis. That's a good thing. And there's a difference between what they're looking at with capital costs compared to what they're looking at with the price of electricity that would come from their plants. At first glance, there was nothing that stung me in the capital costs of the large reactors that I thought was out of the ordinary. The price of electricity coming out of those plants, though, looked particularly odd. Again, only at first glance of looking at the assumptions, they're talking here about a 30-year asset life for a nuclear plant that could last 80 years, maybe 100 years. It looks like they've also assumed that these 24/7 power plants would only operate as little, in some cases, as 53%. That's highly unusual. These plants have capacity factors up to 95%, and we don't know the financing assumptions they have made. And that's on the large reactors. On the small modular reactors, it looks as though they still continue to only use one example, which is a project that fell over in the United States. I mean, seriously, I don't think that's fair on the Australian people to be using one specific project that has had problems, and it's a start-up project anyway. But nevertheless, look forward to looking through the details. I think the big message here for me is that the government is misusing these sort of reports. The government seeks to pit technologies in a fight against each other. That's not how you get prices down. That's not how you provide cheap, consistent, clean energy to Australian consumers. It shouldn't be about technologies fighting each other, but rather working together, complementing each other.
Ted O'Brien, there's a lot to unpack
side,
there. Can I just pull you up on this? Can we just go back to the capital costs? So you don't have any issue with the projected capital cost of a large-scale nuclear power plant at being around about $8.5 billion. You believe that that is a fair estimate?
I'm not commenting on the total price here, Jane, but rather I understand what they're looking at the kilowatt basis, and I look at that and there's nothing that, I'm not saying that's the coalition costings, by the way, but nevertheless, I'm being very candid, saying, you know, one, I'm glad they have included the large reactors.
Mm-hmm.
There's, over 400 of them around the world today. Nations are investing in them as we speak, mm-hmm. So it's good they're in there. The capital costs that they are looking at for those large reactors, I didn't look at that and think there was anything particularly unusual. What was unusual was their assumption about the price of electricity that comes from them.
All right, so the report has found that...
And that's where you look at your financing assumptions,
yep.
your capacity assumptions, your life of asset assumptions. They're the things that are particularly unusual when it comes to those larger reactors.
Okay, so with the large reactors, it's still finding, just before we get to SMRs, Ted O'Brien, it's still finding that large-scale nuclear reactors are in fact cheaper than small modular reactors, but they're still about twice the price of renewables, and I'm talking about the production of energy. It's still going to be producing energy at twice the price of renewables, even when you factor in the cost of new transmission lines, the cost of storage. So I suppose, how do you sell the economics of nuclear power when the CSIRO is saying the capital costs are higher and the cost of producing electricity is twice that of renewables?
As I've just said to you, Jane, I don't accept the price of electricity that I see in this report. Yet to have a look at the assumptions underpinning it, but they haven't disclosed the full financing cost. They're talking about an asset that could last for up to 100 years, only lasting for 30 years. They're saying that these plants might only run for just over half the time, when in fact they're always on 24/7 plants. So the electricity price, I look at that and say, well, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Certainly the SMR ones, I mean, seriously, they've chosen one project that is from a startup that hasn't worked in the United States.
Aren't all SMRs effectively startups at the moment?
Well, no, they're not all based from startup companies. In fact, you have very long-standing conventional companies that today are building nuclear power plants the world over that are actually developing on the small modular reactors. I mean, if you look at Westinghouse, GE Hitachi, Rolls-Royce, I mean, these are very long-standing companies that are basically just making smaller versions of the technology they use today.
And so which country at the moment is using a small modular reactor?
Instead, if I can finish this point, instead they've gone to one SMR design of one startup company that actually has not been all that successful.
Yeah, and this is of course the NuScale project.
It is the NuScale project. It is akin to saying if you're trying to say that small modular reactors aren't feasible because of one project that wasn't running too well, it's like saying that hydro should be ruled out because of the new price of Snowy 2.0.
Which is running at over $12 billion. The CSIRO believes it will take about 15 years to build a nuclear power station, a large-scale nuclear power station in Australia, which means that it would be 2040 by the time we'd have nuclear power. Now, that is well after most of Australia's coal-fired power stations would have closed and would obviously need to have been replaced. So what is the coalition's stopgap between now and 2040 to ensure that we can actually keep the lights on as coal exits the grid?
Firstly, that's the CSIRO's assumption.
What's your assumption?
We have experts across the world who are advising us about the likely timing. ANSTO, for example, which is the Australian government's expert, has its view about how long it takes to construct small modular reactors and large reactors. And so, look, there are a lot of different groups from whom we are taking advice. The advice that we have received is that if you went down the path of small modular reactors, you could have electrons on the grid in 10 years' time. If they were next generation large reactors, it would be a few years, possibly more than that.
15 years seems to be about the ballpark.
We're affirming this up, and we will release all of that once we release our policy. But then to your question on the closure of baseload power, here we have the problem. Under this government, we have the premature closure of baseload power stations. 90% of our baseload power will exit the grid in 10 years' time. This government is suffocating gas. We have massive shortfalls in gas, and their renewable rollout has stalled. And so this creates a big black hole. We're running out of energy. Now, that's not based on my statistics, coalition modelling. That is modelling from the market operator, Clean Energy Council. We have a big problem because we have premature closure of baseload power, suffocation of gas, and their renewable rollout has stalled.
Okay, well, Ted O'Brien,
as a result, we are facing the prospect of blackouts. So what's the coalition's view in contrast, Jane? Number one, we do not support the premature closure of baseload power stations. Number two, we believe we should be pouring more gas into the market. And number three, we need to ensure that we fix the debacle that Labor has started in trying to push for 82% renewables by 2030 without releasing any economic modelling, without showing any evidence it's going to work, and steamrolling over regional communities.
So as part of the coalition's policy, you're saying that you will keep coal-fired power stations open until at least 2040, which is when the first large-scale nuclear power plant could be delivered in Australia. Is that your policy?
No, Jane, that's what you just said. It's not what I just said. So let me repeat.
So when would coal-fired power stations be closing? You were talking about a premature closure. When would you be phasing out coal-fired power stations under a coalition policy?
Our position is clearly this. We have 90% of baseload power at the moment predicted to come out of the grid by 2035. We have a depletion of gas and a stalling of renewables. As a result, we are running out of energy as a country.
And what would the coalition do differently?
The problem. What we would do differently, number one, we do not support the premature closure of coal-fired power stations.
So when do you support the disclosure. That's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of here, Ted O'Brien. I've let you answer questions fully, and I fully respect that you have views here, but what I'm trying to get to the bottom of is, if you're trying to bring nuclear into the grid to replace coal, when does coal exit the grid?
So none of those plants should be forced out of the grid prematurely. And so if you look at Eraring, so let's use a real example, right? If you look at Eraring, the Prime Minister and the Energy Minister has been silent on Eraring, absolute radio silence on the threat of Eraring leaving the grid. But they know full well that if Eraring leaves the grid prematurely, well, the lights are going to go out in New South Wales. This is why the state Labor government in New South Wales is engaging with Origin on that very plant, and as they should be.
But it was Origin Energy's plan to close it.
Here we have an extraordinary situation where we have the coalition spokesperson federally saying, well, good on you, New South Wales Labor government, for engaging proactively on that baseload power station because we don't want the lights to go out.
Yeah.
But we've got radio silence from Albanese and Chris Bowen, who are too weak to deal with this issue.
I appreciate your time today.